Listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be discussing the imperfect tense in Spanish. My name is Dan and my colleague Zach is here to answer any questions you might have throughout or at the end of the webinar, so please send those in at any time. If at any point you need to contact us during your Spanish course and program, there is some information on the slide here on how to get in touch with us. We'd be happy to help. On this slide, you can see the area where you can send in questions that you might have for Zach at any time throughout the webinar. So today we will discuss the uses, the translations, and the verb types of the imperfect tense throughout the webinar. The imperfect tense is a relatively short topic. All right, so this won't be that long. There's not a whole lot to discuss, but it is an important topic, an important tense to be mindful of. You will use it throughout your entire course. So let's begin with the usage, how to use the imperfect tense. It is one of the past tenses in Spanish, one of the forms of the past tense, and it's used to express actions that have started and are ongoing in the past, as well as habitual or repeated actions in the past. It's essentially the opposite of the preterite tense, which you might know a little bit about, whether you've studied it or viewed our webinar on it, or just have a general idea of what the preterite is. The preterite's more used for an action that happened once and ended, wasn't repeated, wasn't habitual, wasn't ongoing in the past, as imperfect tense is used for. As far as the translation of the imperfect tense, all right, you have a few options, a few different ways. The first is progressively speaking, meaning a word like was or were has to be present before a verb that ends in ing, a gerund, a participle. So I was studying. They were reading. As one possible translation. You can see some examples down below. Second is something that used to happen. He used to live in Philadelphia. He no longer lives there. And the last one, not as clear-cut, but has a similar translation to the preterite. And it all depends on the verb in that context. Okay, so those are your three possible translations of this tense, the way that it will sound when translating from Spanish to English. And if you see those options in English, you know that you should be using the imperfect tense in Spanish. Now let's start to discuss how to conjugate verbs, beginning with regular verbs. And remember, just as a reminder, a conjugation is the form of a verb when it is in agreement with a subject. So when you have subject-verb agreement, you have what is known as a conjugation. Okay, so there are two steps to conjugating a regular imperfect tense verb. First, remove the infinitive ending, the AR, the ER, or the IR. And then the second would be to add the imperfect tense endings to that stem. Just remember, the stem is everything that's left over in a verb when the last two letters, the AR, the ER, the IR, have been removed from the infinitive. And as you can see on your slide here, you have two different sets of endings in the imperfect tense. One for AR verbs and the other for ER and IR verbs. On the left side, there's just one accent mark required on the first A and the first plural ending, top right. And on the right side, if you notice, there's an accent on every I in all persons. Okay, so we'll look at a few examples of regular verbs here. Okay, jugar, the verb to play, a game or a sport. You've removed the AR and added your imperfect endings. As you can tell, first plural, the only one with an accent. In the middle, ER example, leer, the verb to read. Remove the ER, add your endings that begin with the letter I with an accent. And remember that accent is on every person for the ER-IR chart. And vestir, the third example, IR verb, same endings as the middle example. They are shared. Vestir is to dress. Vestia, I was dressing, and so on and so forth. Okay, here we have a few practice sentences using regular verbs again. Right, estudiar is the verb to study. Yo estudiaba para mi examen translates as you see above it. I was studying for my test. Probably the best, of the three, but you can even say I studied for my test, implying, over a longer period of time, for a couple hours, repeatedly for that amount of time. Dibujar, our second example, means to draw. So they used to draw, or they were drawing, etc. And finally, vivir, the verb to live. Él vivía en esa casa por mucho tiempo. He lived in that house for a long time. It was ongoing, maybe for many years. Okay, so just a couple example sentences to show those within the context of a sentence. Okay, now we'll transition to irregular verbs. And the good thing about the imperfect tense is that it's quite simple as far as conjugations are concerned. A verb is either regular, as we've already talked about, or it's one of these three irregular verbs, and that's it. There are no stem changing verbs, there's no irregular stems, there's nothing else besides regular or irregular verbs. And these are the only three irregulars that exist: ir, ser, and ver. To go, to be, and to see. And in this case, they don't follow those two steps that we discussed earlier of dropping the infinitive ending and adding the new ending. You just simply have to memorize these. And if you notice, the first two have accents only on first person plural. Íbamos, we were going or we used to go. Éramos, we were. But the third has an accent on all persons. Takes more of that ER-IR rule. Okay, so just a quick review. Verb can either be regular or irregular in the imperfect tense, no stem changes and no other type of verb. And just to show that a little bit more, here are a couple examples of the three irregulars. All right, iba, coming from ir, as you saw in the previous slide. I was going to the store, I used to go to the store, or I went to the store. And you can see the other two examples there. Veían from ver, éramos from ser, and the possible translations of that for each individual sentence there. Okay, to wrap up, just a few reminders. Right? Imperfect is used for progressive actions, either ongoing, or repeated habitual actions. And they can also pertain to actions that sound like the preterite. I lived there for many years, but since it was done for many years, a long period of time, the imperfect is the required tense. And as I've said a few times, no stem changes occur in the imperfect, simply regular or irregular verbs. So it's really one of the shorter tenses, one of the more simple tenses, not a whole lot involved with it, but it is important as you move forward in your program. Okay, that concludes today's webinar. We know it was short, but we do thank you for your attention. If you do have any questions for Zach at this time, please feel free to send them in. Thank you. Good luck in your program. If you do need our help with anything Spanish related, please don't hesitate to contact us.